So this is a staircase put in by the previous homeowner, and as you can tell, it's just very wonky. It's very jacked and crooked, and the lumber was not treated or sealed. So today I am going to completely wipe it to the ground and start from scratch. I was originally going to be using my chainsaw to do the demo work for the staircase, but my chain was very dull and I didn't want to take the time to sharpen it. So instead I ended up using a sawzall to do all of the demo work. Overall, this project took me 7 full days to complete and right at $700. I purchased all of my material, which is all treated lumber, at the Home Depot using my Home Depot consumer credit card. If you have a project on your to-do list and want to help support my channel, then definitely look into the link I left in the description of the video. The longer-term financing with the Home Depot credit card makes tackling these larger jobs a bit easier. Next, I moved on to the task of pulling out these posts that were set in concrete. Now, I know that there's multiple ways of doing this, but I tried a way of using a high lift jack, which, if you're not familiar with, they can be very dangerous, just like any other tool. So if you're going to use one, then be sure to be careful. But I attached 2 2x4s to the front side of the 4x4 so that I could essentially start jacking the post directly up out of the ground. Now, as you can see, it does take quite a bit of effort to use the lift, but I was actually quite enjoying myself, and it took less than a minute to rip each post out of the ground, which I think is outstanding.
Now that's pretty neat.
Oh, nope. Cody! I need your strength!
Yeah, there's no way I'm lifting that.
Sometimes you just gotta know when to call in the help. The last thing I want to do is end up hurting myself. Thank you.
Now, before you say it, a lot of people are often confused by or even insult my husband for not helping me out on tougher jobs like this. And believe me, I have no problem asking for help when I want it or need it. But I do prefer to do things on my own if I'm able to, and he respects that.
There it goes.
With the demo work 100% complete, I then started working on what will be the platform for the new staircase. There are already some existing anchors in this concrete slab, but I just felt better adding a little bit more support. So I went ahead and drilled a few holes in the concrete slab here so I can add in a few additional support brackets. And then I started setting the post in place. I would set the post in its bracket, make sure it was plumb on 2 sides, and then fasten it temporarily with some scraps to hold it in plumb. Then I could move down to the bottom and actually secure it to that bracket. I repeated this to all 4 of the posts. And at this point, I left all of the 4x4 material extra long so that I could set it in place and cut it to its final height later on. And I once again just used some temporary material to cross brace these posts to keep them in plumb on both directions. Then I was able to move to the top, use a speed square to transfer out the height that I needed the platform to eventually be at, and then cut all 4 of the posts to their final height. And I did this using my smaller sawzall. Next, I started cutting and attaching all of the boards that will be the header boards. I'll be using carriage bolts for the majority of this build, which means that I would take my material and first pre-drill my hole placement down on the ground. Then I would clamp the board in place and transfer that hole location into the 4x4 post where it needs to be attached. Hammer the carriage bolt into place and then secure it with a washer and a nut on the back. I did that to all 4 of the boards around the top perimeter, then moved to the bottom and created 4 giant X's that are half-lapped in the center in order to act as the cross-bracing members. And to create this half-lap, I would clamp the piece of material in my super jaws, use my circular saw to make multiple cuts, then come back with a hammer and use the claw end to knock away all the chips. Then set the braces in place and then once again use carriage bolts to fasten them down. Going back up to the top, I laid down a 3rd floor joist with the joist hanger and then started laying down all the decking. For the decking, I'm going with 1x material that is spaced apart 1/4 inch. I would first lay down construction adhesive, place in my spacer, and then secure the board using 2 screws per floor joist. When I got to the very last board, I ripped it to size using my table saw so that it would end up flush. And next I started attaching the 4x4 posts that I'll use later for the handrails. And on these, I used my circular saw to notch them out so that I could just attach them a little bit more securely. Now the corner one was a little bit tricky, although it's very easy to do. Instead of a straightforward half lap, it essentially needed the inside corner notched out so that it will keep this post directly in line with both the left and also that right post, which is important later on whenever I start attaching the handrail portion. Alright, and now it was on to laying out the stringers. I'm going to go ahead and leave you a link in the description to both the videos and the book that I used in order to lay this out. In fact, I got so frustrated trying to get these stringers correct that I ended up calling in my engineering husband to give me a hand with this. Once it was properly laid out though, I went through with my circular saw to make the cut, making sure not to go past the line but just right up to it. I would make all of the cuts going one direction and then come back and make all of the cuts going the opposite direction. Then I would come back with my battery-operated Sawzall and finish making the cut. If you don't have one, then of course a jigsaw would also do the trick nicely. After I got one stringer completely cut out, then I used it as a template to make the other two, and then just repeated the cutting process. I installed the stringer hangers to the header of the structure and then moved the stringer into place and then secured it using nails. Now it's important to already know what material thickness you're going to be using for your treads so that you can line up these stringers correctly so that that top step will come out perfectly flush with your platform. And it just so happened that my stringers were lining up right where a few carriage bolts were. So I used the round portion of my palm sander in order to create some divots so that they could still line up perfectly flush with that header. Once all three stringers were hung, I added in some cross members in between them just to give it a little bit more support. I once again called in Cody's help whenever it came time to install this kicker plate, which goes underneath all of the stringers and gets secured to that concrete pad. I went ahead and used construction adhesive, but then also came back with a few concrete screws to secure it. And before setting this, I did pull a string line from that back post forward to give myself a point of reference to measure off of and get these stringers nice and straight. Once I was satisfied with the placement and that everything was going to come out straight once the handrails were attached, I started attaching my riser material, starting off with the very bottom one. So I cut this riser the same as that riser down there, so now I can move the stringer flush just to square the structure up. And you'll see that I even marked off where that center stringer needed to be moved so that it was in a continuous straight line all the way down. I started off using nails, but then I very quickly switched over to using screws. I would first cut to length and then attach all of my risers, and then come back and install the treads, which is the flat portion of the stairs. To make aligning these go very quickly, since there is an overhang, I cut a scrap piece of wood to size to use as a spacer. Then I would use 3 nails per stringer to secure it. It took a tremendous amount of work in order to get to this point, to where it actually looked and was also being able to be used as stairs. So I was very excited. Hey, get off my stairs. Alright, next step was to start installing the 2 4x4s that I'll use for the handrails going up and down the stairs. I first notched out the treads where they needed to be placed and then attached them using lag bolts. Keep in mind that this handrail portion is of course completely customizable, so go online and look at other staircases to see what you like and don't like before actually tackling this portion. For most of my handrail portion, I'm using 1x material, which is secured by toe nailing into the 4x4 post. Once I established the top and bottom lines of the handrails, then I came back and went ahead and cut those posts to their final height with the angle in it, using a circular saw to make 2 passes. And then it was on to the very tedious task of adding in all of the spindles. And to make this go a little bit quicker, I utilized a jig that was very quickly put together. It's essentially a 2x4 to dictate the spacing in between the spindles, and then another board that goes in exactly half the depth, so that I can set the jig in place the spindle in the corner, and it not only maintain the spacing, but is also in the center of the board. Then I can go to the underside and secure it with a screw. I would go through and secure all of the bottom of the spindles first, then go to the top of the staircase, again utilizing my jig, and secure the top. Once all of the spindles are in place, then I can come back with the final board of trim along the bottom, just to give it a more even and finished look. Then the last thing was the top cap. Again, I started at the very top of the platform and then worked my way down the staircase. I would make sure that the overhang was exactly where I needed it by measuring the top and the bottom before securing it with screws. Now, don't forget, if you have a big project of your own to tackle, to check out phdcard.com/April. So this was a lot more complicated than what I was anticipating, and probably actually the most complicated project that I've yet to tackle. But I am very happy with the way that it came out, and it definitely needed to be done. Now, I still need to come back and set probably 2 more intermediate posts in concrete in order to support these stringers just a tad bit more, but this is going to be great and sturdy enough to walk up and down in the meantime. I also still need to come back and paint it. However, since I use treated wood, I'm going to allow the wood to fully dry out a few weeks, and then I'll come back and paint it. So be sure to follow me on Instagram if you want to see updated photos on it. And of course, if you want more details, then I have left you a link in the description to the written tutorial on my website. So I'm calling this one done. I will see you on my next project. I hope you enjoyed this one.
So just